let's talk about modes. So, try and get the camera steady. This game does a lot of things in modes, or what it calls modes. And these are the tokens. You've got a unit here. I guess the standard mode for a combat unit to be in is what's called combat mode, and that's just like this unit here. It's combat side up. That means its combat value is high. You can flip it over to move mode at the start of a movement phase. This means its movement increases and its combat decreases. If you think, well, that's not really enough movement, I want more movement, you can put it in what's called Strat Mode or strategic mode, where you put one of these markers on it. You can only do this if it's not in an enemy ZOC, and it doesn't move into an enemy ZOC. And it basically means it can double its movement. So this infantry division would then get 10 movement in its movement phase. The disadvantage is it has basically no combat value, and it can suffer in barrages and other things if you look at those tables. So that's strategic mode, movement mode and combat mode all explained. Disorganized mode. This happens as the result of usually barrages. And essentially when lots of shells land on these guys, they lose their cool and start panicking, and that's what this means. A unit which is disorganized, it has a lot of its values halved or reduced by 1, and it's not very good in combat, and it doesn't move very far. Oops, there's it. And finally, exploitation mode. There should be a 1. Nope, no it's not. 1, I'll leave it there anyway. This is just a reward for doing well in combat. If a unit does well in combat, if you get an E result when you roll in the combat results table, it can go into exploitation mode. And this basically means it just gets to move and attack again in the exploitation phase to a limited degree. So those are the modes in the game. It talks about modes. Right, we've got to deal with reserve mode. This is the final mode we need to talk about in the game. Units can be put in reserve. This is a player choice. At the start of your movement, before you do anything else for a unit, or a stack of units, you can stick them in reserve. You're normally going to be limited to the number of reserve markers that you're allowed to use. And essentially all this means is, rather than moving in the normal movement phase and doing combat in the normal combat phase, they're either going to sit there and do nothing in reserve until you take the reserve marker off in the exploitation phase, or until you take the reserve marker off in your opponent's reaction phase. So basically all you're doing with a reserve marker is saying, I'm sticking these units and they're going to do nothing until I choose to release them. And you release them either in the reaction phase or in the exploitation phase. While they're in reserve, they're pretty vulnerable. I can't remember off the top of my head. I think they get reduced combat values. You'll have to check that in the rules. But that's what reserve mode does. You stick a counter on them, a reserve counter, and then you release them later in the turn or in the following turn. You are limited in most scenarios to the number of reserve markers that you're going to receive. In this game, for instance, Reluctant Enemies, the French player gets 3 reserve markers, and the Allies, the Commonwealth, get a similar number. And that's a hard limit. They can't put as many units as they like in reserve mode.